Hello, I'm Matt Travis, Managing Director of Senior Environmental Consultants. We're a multidisciplinary planning and environmental consultancy with 6 offices across the UK. We're in Belfast, Manchester, Sheffield, Cambridge, Cardiff and Bristol. Today I've got Dan Alstead and Helena Du-Roe here with me from our hydrology team, and we're going to talk about flood risk assessments, different types of flooding, modelling, and when you'd use things like sequential tests and how much all of these environmental assessments cost. So Dan, across to you, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, please.
My name's Dan Alstead. I'm Associate Director of the Hydrology team, and I lead a team of hydrologists, modellers and drainage engineers.
Thank you. Helena?
I'm Helena Du-Roe. I'm a Senior Environmental Hydrologist at Enzygo, and I specialise primarily in flood modelling.
Thank you. So just over to a bit of a question today to both of you, and I'll come to you first, Dan. Often when we talk to clients and different people, they don't realise that there are different types of flooding. So what are the sort of principal types of flooding that are there at the moment?
Well, the primary sources of flooding is fluvial and tidal flooding and the interaction between those two, as well as surface water flooding, groundwater flooding, sewer and reservoir flooding.
And that's all quite interesting because some of those, like reservoir flooding, you might not think about. And when we talk about surface water flooding, that's water that's just coming from the rain and running off land. So that brings you all, with all these different types of flooding, Helena, when would you use flood modelling and what would you apply it for?
Flood modelling itself, I kind of use it you see the Environment Agency maps online, whether that be fluvial, tidal or surface water. And essentially some of it may not be mapped, some of it may not look correct. So we'll look at it and maybe it looks a bit blocky, and then for us that's a kind of a telltale sign. It might need to basically be modelled itself. So that's kind of number one we'll look at, or if there's no outline at all. Another key indicator is surface water mapping itself as well, because sometimes surface water mapping can be indicative of fluvial flooding. So it's the bit of looking at that early stage just to have a look to see what it might be.
Not just that, it's also assessment of climate change, so for the lifetime of a development, so you may want to run an existing model to allow for future climate change allowances.
And I think one of the key things that I see in both your pieces of work is when you do flood modelling for pluvial, which is surface water, or fluvial, which is rivers, often you're doing that because a client's come to you with a site and you've identified that by a client using your expertise that you can maybe increase the developable area, or you can get a better access to the site, or you can negate and mitigate some of those things. But that leads me on to a question, Dan, and I'm sure you have a few of these. What are the most common mistakes that are made by developers?
I would say the most common mistake is not scoping the baseline conditions of a site, going in, developing a layout and not considering the extent of flooding within a site and developing outside of that. So
what you're tending to get from people is they've come to you with a layout, not considered any of the constraints, and then we've got to try and shoehorn that layout into the constraints around it, and that's when you might come to Helena and do some of the flood modelling.
Yeah, exactly. So it might be that there's a surface water flow pathway through the site and someone's decided just to put some residential units in it. In reality, we might need to remove those units and put a sort of swale to convey the flow path through the site itself.
So what about other things in drainage? Do we see common mistakes that are made there as well?
Yes, another common mistake is, again, not setting aside enough space within a development to locate suds attenuation systems. And developing that out also outside of a flood zone. Quite typically you can find that attenuation can be based in a flood outline.
And I think that's really important because once you come to professionals like yourselves, you can understand those constraints, you get the constraint map, you can build that up. Because quite often when you're looking at developments, you might often see an unrealistic number of units or unrealistic building orientation that when you've got the constraints, you'd have never been able to achieve that on that site anyway. Something that's much more topical at the moment in flooding, and I'll come across to you on this, Dan, is groundwater flooding is becoming more topical with the lead local flood authorities, and how are you dealing with that in your flood risk assessments?
Well, initially we look at some online mapping, so we look at what the geology is, we look at some borehole records if there's any available locally. We get some complex groundwater flood mapping, and we consult with the lead local flood authority to see whether they are aware of any pre-existing groundwater issues in the local area. And we may want to then investigate further into that by installing on-site borehole wells and undertaking 6 to 12 months of groundwater monitoring.
And when you undertake that groundwater monitoring, when is it normally the highest in the year and when is it the lowest?
Typically, you want to be monitoring at least over the winter period when it's the wettest period, so that's November through till April.
And then obviously if you've got high groundwater on your site, how does that influence your drainage?
Well, you may want to line your attenuation and ensure that groundwater doesn't ingress into that attenuation feature and use up its capacity.
So something that we quite commonly get asked at Zygo is what is the sequential test and how is it applied? I don't know which one of you want to take that one forward. Is that one for Dan or is that one for you, Helena?
Maybe one for Dan, and I add some comments in afterwards.
Okay, over to you, Dan.
Well, typically the sequential test would aim to locate development, particularly if you were looking at residential, which is considered more vulnerable development, to where it's at least at the lowest risk, so perhaps into flood zone 1. However, you may end up with a site that's mostly located in flood zone 1, but you may prove, or she may already show off proven through modelling that part of a site may be in flood zone 2 or 3, which is medium to high risk. In that instance, you may want to consider sequentially developing the site so your development and attenuation goes outside the flood zone. And you may also want to ensure that your access egress is also located outside of that flood zone.
Yeah, exactly correct what Dan said. It's also good getting agreement with the regulators such as the Environment Agency and the LLFA to make sure that whatever you've kind of put on paper as the flood risk, you get agreement on before going through all these processes as well.
That makes sense because if you've not got the agreement on your baseline, you can often trip yourself up as you go through planning.
Yeah.